Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. Our democracy is under extraordinary strain right now. The rule of law, the Constitution are under attack. The right to vote is under assault in ways that we all know about. These issues are central to our politics, dividing the country, and are increasingly at the front of all of our minds as we live through this challenging and unusual period. What can we do about it? These debates really can sound sometimes abstract, like something for footnotes for lawyers, but it's really something for all of us, for every citizen to care about and to speak out about, because it's really a story we're all writing together. That's why it's really terrific for us to be joined today by Joyce Vance. She is the author of a new book, Giving Up is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping democracy. She's probably well known to all of you. She is a former top prosecutor. She was the U.S. Attorney in Alabama. She's a professor at the University of Alabama Law School, the author of a widely read Substack, a commentator on MSNBC, and a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. Joyce, it is great to have you as part of this conversation, and I know that you are in the middle of a really potentially, I would guess, exhausting book tour, which is so encouraging that there's so much interest. How has it been going, and how have you found that approach?
You know, it has been more invigorating than exhausting, just because getting out and being able to talk to people about how they're feeling about democracy, what they're doing, what their concerns are, what their hopes are. I think we all need to do more of that. I mean, at the risk of being a little bit sappy and patriotic, I'll just say that is what we all need to do right now.
And it's interesting and encouraging how much those patriotic notes still really do, I think, resonate with people. They just don't hear it enough. And I think sometimes people are worried that it sounds corny or who am I to raise that flag? But I think it's still our most powerful set of arguments. I was thinking about the book, and I should be a proper podcast host and show it because it's really wonderful, and it's learned and passionate and action oriented, and I think usable also. What brought you to writing about this, given all you've done, and in a sense, who was your audience as you're writing something like that? Who were you thinking you were writing for?
So I got worried in the days following Kamala Harris's loss, where people weren't just depressed like people always are when they lose an election. People seemed ready to give up. And I heard so many people say, I did everything that I could do. I didn't leave anything on the table, and we lost. I just need to give up. I'm just going to walk away from it all. And I heard that so pervasively that I became deeply concerned that we were living in this sort of watershed moment where Americans might give up and roll over and let Trump 2.0 do its worst. And so I decided to write this book. The subtitle is A Manual for Keeping a Democracy, and that's very much how it's written, to give people, it's not step by step, right? Because it looks different for each of us, what role we're going to play in saving this democracy. But I hoped that people would understand that they had an invitation to do it, that they had the tools that they needed to do it, and that if we all did it together, it's sort of that lesson of the civil rights movement, that when we are all in community, we can all prosper. I hoped people would take that message away from the book too.
One of the things that I really love about it so much is, first of all, some of the best works are written in the white heat of passion and concern and of the moment. And it isn't necessarily better to work 10 years on something when the moment is right and it needs to be said. And also that there's I think, implicit in it, a faith in people who are not law professors or former prosecutors like you, but that these really critical concepts need to be understood by everybody, and that they can take a dose of history and a dose of what is the unitary executive theory, And that actually is a sort of a mobilizing thing and a motivating thing rather than, something you put on the high shelf. And I think that's really important. And that you chose to do it that way is really great. Did you enjoy writing it?
Yeah, I had actually a good time writing the book, or maybe it's like childbirth. And now that it's over, I think I had a good time writing the book. Early on, it was frustrating because, Trump was spewing these policies through sort of this wide diameter hose, and I would write something and then it would be out of date. So it took me a while to make that adjustment. But Michael, I think you hit on something that was really important to me early on, which was, my experience as a federal prosecutor, my experience as a U.S. attorney, my experience doing TV commentary for MSNBC and meeting a lot of people, was that Americans are incredibly smart and incredibly capable of understanding democracy. You don't need a law degree to get this stuff. Yes, the unitary executive theory is a little bit of highfalutin inside baseball, theory about democracy and government. But when someone takes the time to explain that, folks can understand it. And more than the ability to understand it, it's essential for our democracy that Americans have that knowledge. We live in a sketchy time for civics education as a country. We could do better, and I write a lot about that in the book. I suppose I would say that this was my way of getting the ball rolling on that.
I think it's really noteworthy. We have a lot of brilliant people, as you know, at the Brennan Center, and I find myself sometimes having to remind them, this is a jury trial. This is the arguments we're making in the court of public opinion is not for the appellate court. It's a jury trial. And I think that your experience actually talking to people selected at random, in a sense, about important matters over your career is really important. And I think it's one of the interesting and noteworthy things about the American system. We can all bemoan or celebrate the number of lawyers in public life. But especially in the South, I think, the legal profession has played a very particular role, often in the absence of other institutions fighting for equality, to actually bring these concerns to people. I wanted to ask you a question about your title. The title, of course, is Giving Up is Unforgivable. Unforgivable is a strong word. Why did you choose that as the way to introduce the ideas to people?
So I actually toyed with other formulations, right? Giving up is bad. Giving up would be wrong. Giving up would be a silly thing to do. This was the formulation that got it right. And it was something that I'd actually heard Joe Biden say right after the election was over. He had just been, I think, taking questions at a press conference, and he said it. And it stuck with me to the point where I couldn't get out of my head. And that was what I wanted to convey, was that it would simply be unforgivable.
One of the things that you write about is something a friend said to you, or maybe wrote to you, which is, if I don't watch, it isn't happening. And I sometimes, I'll confess, I've shared that impulse after the
we all have.
Yeah, and it was such an adrenaline overdose in the first 4 years of Trump, and then obviously there's been a lot going on since then, but the feeling of preemptive exhaustion was something to really battle, I think, coming into this. Nevertheless, it's certainly the case that the fears we had about the assaults on the rule of law, the thrust to expand presidential power well beyond what the Constitution contemplates, and all the risks we're seeing, I think at this point have energized people. One of the things that I love about the book is that you draw historical parallels and root our current challenges in history, which to me actually helps a lot in making me realize that I haven't lost all sense of reality, but that there are some big themes, some big fights throughout history that we're dealing with. And you talk about the lost cause, the way in which the defense of slavery and the slave system, and then the attempt to undo Reconstruction, which was this all too brief effort to actually build a multiracial democracy in the South after the Civil War, and then it was basically smeared after the fact and covered up and pushed back, and then how much effort it took through the civil rights movement both to recover that history and reverse that reverse direction and continue to expand those rights. How important that is in understanding not just American history, but the moment that we're in. And you talk about a lot about the voting rights history and the Voting Rights Act. Do you believe that a lot of what we're living through right now is a continuation of that racial backlash? How do you see John Lewis's struggles connecting with what we're going through right now?
I think if we're smart and if we're willing to learn the lesson, we can take that history and use it to our advantage in this moment. Because the lesson of post-Civil War in the South is that there was a failure of accountability, that people were readily pardoned for reasons that I sort of talk about ad nauseum in the book. That became the modus operandi to restore the body politic. And there are some good reasons for doing that, right? It permits the country to move forward. Unfortunately, that absence of accountability permits the romanticization of the Old South and slavery and this sort of romantic story of the lost cause, the portrayal of the Confederacy as heroic. And that's what in many ways made it possible for these sort of white supremacist groups to survive in that period, almost as the legacy of that, even though they were pushed off to the side, this notion that they had a legitimate spot in history is, I think, in many ways responsible for what we saw on January 6th, for the Proud Boys, for other movements like that, at least to an old Southern prosecutor, are very reminiscent of the Ku Klux Klan. So the lesson that we learn, I think, is this. If you take a snapshot of this moment that we're in, it looks pretty fraught. There are obviously serious challenges to democracy. If you instead look at the videotape, so to speak, and if you look at the experience after the Civil War, and if you look through the civil rights movement, which, didn't look like it had great odds of success at the start, right? Folks, the foot soldiers will tell you that they faced insurmountable odds. In Selma and in Birmingham, protesters were being beaten. They were being attacked by dogs. Law enforcement was against them. They were being attacked in the streets. Children were being arrested and held in custody. And despite all of that, instead of giving up on democracy, they did something very different. Led by Dr. King, they made the decision to fight for the promise of democracy in a peaceful manner so that it would include them. And that seems to me very instructive in this moment. I think our mission in many ways is very similar.
And it's so interesting. You're exactly right. Of course, there was no holiday to Dr. King then. It was very controversial. And often the tactics, even though nonviolent, because they provoked a reaction and created chaos deliberately to be televised to the world very often, those tactics were controversial or people easily lost patience. And thus their courage really was particularly critical. It's also the case that they were particularly savvy about understanding that, especially after World War II and the unifying patriotic experience of World War II and fighting against fascism and against racial laws and that sort of thing, that there was a civic creed to appeal to, that they could go back to that well of the American civic experience as the basis for why they were doing what they were doing. Again, to try to draw in people who were, in effect, thought of themselves as bystanders. They weren't really bystanders, but to pull a majority in. And if you look, I'm always struck by when you look, just for example, at the Brown v. Board of Education case, which was a few years before, it was actually very popular with the country. A lot of these things were very popular outside the immediate places where the fights were happening. At least people thought they were sympathetic until it came into their own communities and they had to face up to the need to change all across the country, not just on TV, things they saw on TV. But the key element was the courage and determination of the regular, ordinary people in Selma and everywhere else that we all know about, and which can be easily romanticized looking backwards in PBS, documentaries, but which really required guts and the willingness to put bodies on the line, and is a kind of a lesson for any of us in much more comfortable circumstances that, you don't get to choose when history demands of you to step up. But in a lot of ways, we're in a moment like that now.
Very much so. And the great thing that we're learning today, like they learned in the civil rights era, is that courage is really contagious. And so if you are smart enough to surround yourself with good people, whether that's online or in real life, that courage will buoy you. It will lift you up, and you will find, wherever your passions take you. I have friends and students who believe that their best defense of democracy is through the arts, through writing music, or through writing poetry. And I think we have to be willing to expand our notion of what the fight for democracy includes, right? Because in so many ways, I think the reference to the arts, the people who are making films, the people who are talking about it in these entertainment settings are incredibly powerful, because it means that we have a pro-democracy culture. And of course, that's something that folks who write about countries that came out of communism in Eastern Europe had to develop. They could teach democracy in schools, and that was important, but they also had to make it a centerpiece in their culture. And we have had the luxury of taking democracy for granted for so many decades in this country that it's time for us to begin to center it in our culture again as well.
That's really interesting. And, it's a bit of a cliche, but the idea that politics is downstream of culture is really true. And
yes,
and we have that culture lying around us, but we need to kind of understand where it fits in to this story, and again encourage people to see this as an act of itself, an act of commitment. One of the things in the book that you talk about, which I thought was so interesting, you write that we no longer live in a world, I wrote it down, that requires a storm the palace coup for a dictator to take over a democracy. And I thought that was striking, first of all, because we actually had a storm the palace coup in the sense of the capital of the United States being stormed by the insurrectionist mob sent there and motivated by Donald Trump and his false claims of a stolen election. You have really interesting things to say at the time and in retrospect about what we did wrong and right, and mostly wrong, in trying to hold those people to account, so that January 6th and what Trump did then became a disqualifying breakpoint in history, which of course it has not, since he then subsequently won the election, actually won it. You wrote early on, soon after the events of January 6th, that it would be a mistake, maybe I'm mischaracterizing what you wrote, to focus prosecutions on the thousands of people who stormed the Capitol, many of whom were deluded by their leaders who believed their lies, and that the efforts should be focused on the leaders of the conspiracy, those who instigated this, again, knowing very well, pretty plainly, that of course Trump had lost the election. That was not a universally shared opinion at the time, though I think you could certainly argue that it's been upheld. Could you explain a little more about your thinking over the years on this? Has it evolved, and what mistakes do you think have been made in holding them accountable?
So look, I think I'm definitely in the minority in this regard, but this is my view. And keep in mind that I'm an old prosecutor. I used to do big drug cases. We once put 300 plus people in Northeast Alabama in prison, to the point where the locals began joking that we should just build a chain link fence around this one area called Sand Mountain. What I know you must do to deal with crime, to both punish it and to prevent future crime, is that you must deal with the people who are the most responsible. The most culpable people must pay the price for the crimes, and they must pay the biggest price. And the way you get there as a prosecutor is what we call going up the chain or working up the ladder, because often it's very difficult to go straight to the most culpable people. And so you start with people who would be characterized as little fish, smaller criminals, and perhaps you give them a deal in exchange for information and reliable testimony that can be used to keep working up the chain until you reach the people most culpable. My view immediately after January 6th and my view today is that that's what we should have done. We should have worked as quickly as possible to get to the top of the food chain. And look, I don't say that critically because I understand what DOJ was trying to do. For one thing, they wanted to create accountability for people who had stormed the Capitol. For another thing, they wanted to avoid dividing the country further. And we were in a difficult moment. And there was a view that said that Donald Trump had burned himself out, that he was disgraced, that he would step away from the public stage, and that he would not be involved in American politics anymore. That view turned out to be a short-sighted view that did not work out. And it certainly runs afoul in any event of my feeling very much like what happened at the end of the Civil War, where leaders were allowed to avoid accountability. Their citizenship was restored. They, became the subject of Confederate memorials. That, I think, is the same mistake that we've made, although it's difficult in many ways to judge this close to the history. But that, I think, was a failed effort in many ways.
We got to make sure we're not living through another premiere of Birth of a Nation on a big scale. And, you quote and talk about, it's so striking how many different parts of the system and the people in the commanding heights of those parts made judgments that altogether created the situation we're in. Senator Mitch McConnell, of course, saying on the floor of the Senate as to why he would not vote to convict Donald Trump in the second impeachment. Well, we have a criminal justice system that will take care of him, and privately saying, oh, don't worry, the Democrats will do that for us. The Justice Department, and this is a question for you, moving it now is quite clear too slowly, in the sense that Attorney General Garland appointed a special prosecutor, but only after the January 6th committee made a powerful criminal referral. And in a sense, of course, former Judge Garland himself was kind of like a special prosecutor, because the extra added protection of him being so esteemed as a judge, I think was probably intended, I'm assuming, to give him more room to maneuver. And then the assumption that the Supreme Court would do what had always been assumed to be the case. And I think every time I read the Trump versus United States opinion, my blood pressure goes up a little more, and then I have to not read it for a while. It is so much worse than it needed to be, and so much worse than was expected, in creating, for the first time, an articulated immunity from the law and from criminal prosecution for somebody who had previously been a president, when it had been clear to everybody, going back to the language of the Constitution, that an ex-president could be prosecuted for crimes they committed while in office. That's in the language of the Constitution, as well as everybody's assumption afterwards. And the dangerous parts of that ruling, including John Roberts' assertion of the most radical version of, as we talked about before, the unitary executive theory that, oh, well, the executive branch is the only branch that is a person, which is basically what one might have said about the King of England, but not anything that we had assumed previously to be the case in that kind of form about the executive branch. Over and over again, these people missed the moment in a way. And I guess, did they believe too much that the system would just on its own hold? Or how do you account for this story? Because it is really a disturbing failure of the system to respond to this attack on American democracy.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, as far as the conservative majority on the Supreme Court goes, it seems like they completely forgot the principle that no man is above the law, and decided to put, in effect, one man in our country above the law. and certainly the wrong man in the wrong moment. If anything, Donald Trump was a cautionary tale that bore out all of the worst fears of the founding fathers, the reasons that they had rejected the idea of concentrating too much power in the hands of the presidency. I will confess it may just be that I worked in the institution for a long time, but I'm far more forgiving when it comes to the Justice Department, although I sharply disagreed with the failure to charge on that prosecution and said that a lot on a couple of podcasts, including the one that I do with Preet Bharara throughout that first year when there was no sign of any prosecution at DOJ, right? We would have seen subpoenas being suppressed, or we would have seen leaks, and there was just nothing going on. And I suspect that the folks at Main Justice worried about the alternative scenario, the one where they went after Donald Trump full force and it whipped the mob back into a frenzy. And we saw, an uptick in activity like what happened on January 6th. So in many ways, it was a situation of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And prosecutors live in that world, right? That's very often where we find ourselves. And so what you really have to do is take yourself out of the political sort of a milieu and just do the right thing. You can't try to game the politics. And time again, we've seen that when the Justice Department gets too close to politics and tries to do the right thing that direction, that there can be problems, and that what DOJ must do is simply its job to follow the facts and the law and prosecute those who violate serious federal laws.
And, it is right and true that whatever decisions were made or not made by the Justice Department, they did bring the prosecution, unprecedented in American history. And if the Supreme Court had ruled as they should have, both promptly and as all constitutional precedent would have suggested, then the timing of the Justice Department and the decisions of the Justice Department would have held up much stronger, because, in fact, by getting the January 6th investigation public as it was, it created a predicate for that much more. It was really it's important. I do think you're right that the Supreme Court should never, ever, ever be let off the hook on the role it played there. So much flowed from that. Interestingly, there has never been, other than in occasional social media posts by the President of the United States, there has never been a scintilla of an allegation that the Justice Department was improperly prodded by the White House, by Joe Biden, to take this unprecedented step of prosecuting Donald Trump for January 6th. And of course, we're living through a moment where there's been an explicit politicization of the Justice Department, some of it in reaction to the claims about the last 4 years, but it didn't really need that for that to be done. But an unprecedented politicization, a direct message that was made public by the president, in effect ordering Attorney General Pam Bondi to bring prosecutions against political critics, against James Comey, the former FBI director, and Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, where both line prosecutors and political appointees had said, there's no case here, and much more. And we've talked about this a lot. We had a conversation a few weeks ago, as you may know, with Vanita Gupta, who was the Associate Attorney General under Biden, and Peter Keisler, who had been the acting Attorney General and head of the Civil Division at DOJ under George W. Bush, coming from very different political backgrounds, both absolutely appalled by the politicization that we are, if I can say it correctly, but that we are seeing. You talk about the rule of law and institutions as mattering. You care a lot and you write a lot and talk a lot about DOJ. What is it that people who have not worked at DOJ, I did not work there, what is it that we need to understand about why it's so important to not let it go off the rails?
Do we have about a semester's worth of time?
Do we get credit?
I'll give you credit, yes, but you have to take the test at the end. Yeah. This is a hard question, but it's also a very simple one. At bottom, the Justice Department is the only cabinet level agency whose name is a moral virtue, right? Justice. It's the aspirational goal for our society, and it's what separates us from the monarchies that the founding fathers were eager to leave behind. This notion that we are a country of laws, not of men.
You describe the book as a manual for keeping democracy. And the question people always ask is, what can I do? And of course, voting is one of the things, but voting is not the only thing that citizens can do right now to step up and be part of saving the institutions we care about and the democracy we cherish. What you write is that the most important piece of knowledge to carry with you to the reader is that you are not powerless. I thought that was very powerful. What is it that people should know that they can do and what their power is?
Wannabe dictators, the whole gig is to overwhelm people so that they give up, to make themselves appear to be inevitable so people give up, to tell people that they are powerful, they, the dictator, are powerful, and the people themselves can do nothing to counter them. And that's just not true. And so my hope, sort of to fill in on our point that I think Americans are very smart, capable people, is to better understand how our government is formulated and who power resides with. And ultimately, that is people. And we have seen this administration back down repeatedly when it's been challenged by people who understand that, whether that was in the District of Columbia, where they attempted a takeover of government and were blocked, whether that was the power of the No Kings marches, which certainly caused this president to take note of his nosediving popularity. And again, we see that in ways big and small. We see that happening in the courts when the administration is blocked. We see that happen when leaders stand up and explain how their institutions work. The foundational piece of knowledge that every American can take away is that they shouldn't give up either, and they should actively look for opportunities to get engaged. I think voting is a huge part of it. We will have elections in 2028 because Donald Trump, like every other wannabe dictator, wants that appearance of legitimacy, right? It's why we'll have midterms in 2026. It's the reason that Vladimir Putin continues to hold elections, because it's just that little sliver of democracy that they can wrap themselves in to try to appear to be legitimate is so important. And that means the challenge for us is to make sure that those elections are free and fair, because it's very certain that this country is on a trajectory where we will see voter suppression evolved in ways that we haven't seen it quite as advanced as maybe since the civil rights era, right, where there was just a concerted effort to suppress the vote. We're seeing something very similar to that now. And that means that literally every American has to be prepared to vote, prepared to register, to make sure that they stay registered, that they vote, and that their vote gets counted. But there is so much more than that, as you point out. And it's this notion that we are all part of the body politic, that we actually have elected representatives who work for us. And I know a lot of people, especially if you live in a red state like me, people have given up pressing on their senators. They say they don't answer, they won't hold town halls. This is a moment for us to reclaim the notion that we elect them and not the other way around, and to actually demand that our elected officials do their job, that they live up to their oaths. And we have to be willing to back that up. That means civic engagement in a way that we are not always used to, in a way that might feel uncomfortable, quite frankly, to some of us who don't really love to engage in confrontation. But this is a moment to demand answers and accountability from your elected officials.
And one of the things that is heartening, despite this moment of polarization and intense political conflict, is the times when people from across the political spectrum, from both political parties or no political party, speak out in different ways. We're having this conversation a few days before the Supreme Court will be hearing a major case on presidential power, asking whether Donald Trump's unilateral imposition of massive tariffs, the Liberation Day tariffs, is legal. And every court that has looked at it so far has said, no, in fact, it is not legal. We at the Brennan Center are part of a very wide array of groups whether the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is a very conservative group, the Cato Institute, us, all saying that this actually violates what the Constitution means. And George F. Will, the esteemed longtime conservative columnist for the Washington Post, wrote about our brief. The fight to vote, the fight to ensure that we have free and fair elections that you describe is taking place in communities all across the country where election officials of both parties and law enforcement of both parties or no party have said, you know what, we want to have free and fair elections. We're not going to let all the political nonsense get in the way. It's actually the civic spirit of the exhausted middle that has done the most to save the country before, and I think that we can all hope we'll do so again. Joyce Vance, thank you for your voice. Thank you for this book. Thank you for being part of the Brennan Center's community, for all you do to teach your students and the rest of us about the Constitution and the law. And thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this show, please give us a boost in our new experimental podcast form by subscribing, by liking, and sharing it with your friends. That's the best way to get the word out. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a 5-star rating. Thanks so much. We appreciate it, and we'll see you soon.